Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Much better. Thank you. I'm glad that you're still awake. Today we have a really exciting guest, Mr. Clayton. And Mr. Clayton is probably one of the smartest guys I know, other than Mr. Bo. But anyway.
Hey, do I,
Oh, and I'm sorry, Mr. Barrett. Anyway, so we invited Mr. Clayton here because he is very, very involved in the city of Manchester, a great friend to the Rotary, who's a great friend to us, and he knows everything there is to know about Manchester, never mind all other places in the world, but he is an expert. He writes for the newspaper, he has books that he's written, and he's just a fascinating person who knows so much that you will really enjoy. So everybody, in your most respectful manner, I want you to hear Mr. John Clayton today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's probably a good thing that Mrs. Machado White didn't mention that I'm a graduate of Manchester High School West, one of the other 4 high schools in Manchester. So know that. And when Mr. Barrett asked me to come and speak to you, the question was, what would the topic be? And he said, can you talk about immigration in Manchester? And I can talk about that. I have a book a friend of mine did called Different Roots, Common Dreams, in which he celebrates the new Americans who are making their homes in Manchester. But I want to ask you, how many people here are Native American? Native American. I don't mean you were born here, I mean, are you an Indian? Okay, everybody who does not have your hand in the air, you are either an immigrant or the child of immigrants. And you need to know that to understand what Manchester is and always has been. You need to know a couple of things about those Native Americans. We know that they lived in this area near the Merrimack River 11,000 years ago. We know that because they found an Indian burial site when they were doing some excavation. Archaeologists from all over the country came to Manchester to find out what was in those grave sites, and by using a process called carbon dating, they were able to determine that people have lived in this area for more than 11,000 years. Why here? Because of the Merrimack River in particular, but also specifically the Amoskeag Falls. Today, when you look at the Merrimack River, you see a nice orderly dam, but in the day 11,000 years ago, the Amoskeag Falls was a series of rapidly descending chutes and rapids, not like Niagara Falls. Don't think one big drop-off. It was a really rough stretch of the river. And the Native Americans would go there because fish would try to make their way upstream. They would exhaust themselves trying to get up those rapids and come to rest in the pools below. And the Native Americans would go out with their nets and their dugout canoes, and they would harvest the bounty of the fish and eels from the Merrimack River. The word Amoskeag means place of many fish, and that's where the Native Americans settled. When did the first white settlers come here to Manchester? It was not until 1720. They were coming here from Scotland and Ireland, and they settled south of us in Londonderry, and eventually they called this community Derryfield. That matters. In 1831, and if you're paying attention, I just jumped about 100 years ahead in time, there was something taking place in Ireland in which people were starving. Does anybody know? The potato famine. Yeah, in my family, it was simply called the hunger. So these unskilled Irish laborers were fleeing Ireland because of the hunger and coming to this area in Manchester, or Derryfield, around 1830 and 1840, which is when a group of Boston businessmen got together and decided to buy 15,000 acres of farmland here and create what would become an industrial utopian community where people would want to come and live and work. So they started by building mills. And who built the mills? Those unskilled Irish laborers who were coming here were available to do any kind of work possible to feed their families. So as the mills were being built, it was the Irish immigrants who came here, who dug the canals that would power the mills, who cut the granite that would be the foundations, who laid the bricks that would become the incredible mill yard that we still have here in the city of Manchester. Irish immigrants, wow, and they came here to work. So as soon as the first mill was built, this being a small farming community, it didn't take long until all the people in the neighborhood were working at the mill. And they, again, they had visions for a grand community, a number of mills and residential parts, churches and land for schools and parks and playgrounds. And so as they wanted to expand, the need for more workers became apparent. While that famine was taking place in Ireland, there were similar events happening in the Canadian Maritime provinces, the eastern part of Canada. So Amoskeag, in need of workers, put agents on trains who went up to Montreal and Quebec City to recruit French-Canadian workers to come and live and work in Manchester, in the mills. And they were very successful. At one time, Manchester was more than 50% French-speaking. And people like Michelle, who have our Franco-American descent, can probably tell you about that. And so Manchester's Franco-American community grew and grew. So now you have three general populations in the city. You have the Scots-Irish, you have the Irish, and then you have the Franco-Americans coming here. But the city's going to continue to grow. They set aside 700 acres of land on both sides of the Merrimack River for industry, and the rest of the 15,000 acres they bought was going to be designed, again, to create an orderly community where people would want to come and live and work. It all revolved around textiles. It's not very sexy, I know. When I was a kid, history to me was about cowboys and Indians. That's what I wanted to watch. I didn't want to watch a documentary about people making cotton fabric. Although I should point out that the denim for the first Levi's ever made was made right here in Manchester. That's a little bragging point if you're wearing Levi's. I know they come and go in style. So know that. Amoskeag needs more workers. Their product line begins to change. In the beginning, they were making something called ticking, which is a really coarse blue and white striped fabric that they used to cover mattresses and pillowcases. If you're of a certain age, you'll remember that. Then they made denim, and then they started making finer fabrics because the fashion industry was growing in America in the late 1800s, and Amoskeag wanted to be a part of that. So they literally would go to the New York fashion shows like they have today and bring their product line to demonstrate the depth of their abilities to create fabric. At one time, when Amoskeag was at its peak, those mills produced 470 miles of fabric per day. That's pretty much from here to Washington, per day, coming out of the mills. So what are they going to make next after making denim? Gingham. Gingham was a very colorful fabric for women, women's dresses. And to make that fabric, you had to have people who were very talented at dyeing cloth, dyers. The best dyers in the world were in Scotland. So what does Amoskeag do? They put agents on boats, they couldn't use the train this time, to go out to Scotland to recruit dyers to come and live and work in Manchester. So now we have a Scottish community. Who knew? Now, what do we want to do? We want to put lace collars on those dresses, nice lace collars. The best lace makers in the world were in Belgium. So agents from Amoskeag go to Belgium to recruit lace makers to come and live and work in Manchester. So you're seeing an ethnic diversity start to emerge in the city, not based on refugee circumstances or famine all times, it's economic immigration. People are coming to Manchester to live and work because it's a great way to make a living and use their skills. Amoskeag continued to grow. They kept building more mills, and with the looms, the machinery, including the heavy turbines that were powered by the water in the canals to turn the looms, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have to wait for contractors or subcontractors if a piece of machinery broke. So they created a machine shop in which they could make all of the heavy metal materials they needed themselves. It was called the Foundry. And if you don't know, my friend Dean Kamen just opened a restaurant in the Mill Yard last year called the Foundry, as a tribute to Manchester's industrial heritage. So we need engineers to run that. Who were the best engineers in the world at the time? They were from Germany. So once again, Amoskeag starts its global recruitment of engineers to come live and work in Manchester, most of them German. So as a kid growing up on the west side of Manchester, people tended to think of it as monolithic French-Canadian. In fact, the west side was known as La Petite Canada, which means Little Canada. We also had a vibrant German neighborhood and Belgian neighborhoods. So when I would walk to school in the morning at Goswell Park School, I would hear 4 different languages being spoken. And I thought that's how everybody in the world grew up, not knowing that Manchester was a really unique community because of that. So now we have this ethnic diversity. How does it manifest itself in the way in which you live your lives? Eventually, there's a process called assimilation. When you first come here from another land, and this is happening today, oftentimes you tend to gravitate to people with whom you have common circumstances, whether it's language, usually it's language, love of food, religion. So we had pockets, ethnic pockets around the city. So there would be a German neighborhood here, there'd be a Greek neighborhood here, a Polish neighborhood. And so what you get is this mosaic. You all know those little tiles you used to make ashtrays in the summertime? A mosaic that paints a picture of a city that's really remarkably diverse. Racially diverse, not necessarily, but ethnically diverse. We always hear when the presidential primary comes around that Manchester or New Hampshire is not a really good representative example because we don't have enough diversity. I would argue that Manchester is probably more diverse than many communities in the country. And so now the racial diversity is something else we're coming to see today. Questions? Okay, I don't want anybody falling asleep on me.
I've actually read that book today.
You've read this book?
I've
At the bank? Probably St. Mary's Bank, I'm guessing. Yeah, you know why? St. Mary's Bank was created simply to serve the Franco-American workers, the French-speaking workers who came to Manchester. When they got their pay packet in the mills on Thursday, and you got a pay packet, you did not get a check, it was cash. The French-Canadian workers were suspicious of the English-speaking bankers on Elm Street. So rather than taking their pay packet and putting it in an Amoskeag bank or Merchants Bank, they took the money home. And what did they do with it? Yes, you're right, say it out loud.
Put it in the mattress.
They put it under the mattress. That's what they thought was safe. No one would come in. There was a series of tenement fires on the west side in Manchester. And if 3 families had put their money under the mattress and the home burns down, that's 3 families facing economic ruin. The parish priest at St. Marie's, the gorgeous church on the west side, was named Monsignor Pierre Hevy. And he wanted to serve his flock, the French-speaking worshipers. So there was a movement underway in Canada called the Credit Union. So Monsignor Hevy brought a gentleman named Desjardins down to Manchester, and they had a meeting at St. Mary's Church. 239 parishioners signed a petition to bring the first credit union in America to Manchester. So in 2008, St. Mary's Bank celebrated 100 years of history, specifically to serve an immigrant population. And so this book, again, Different Roots, Common Dreams, which celebrates new Americans in Manchester, was a logical supporting device for St. Mary's Bank. They love this project, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. So now again, you serve these different groups. On the German west side, there is still a German social club called the Workmen's Club. It's AKUV, and it's a long German phrase. It starts with Arbeiten, which means work. So the German workers had their own social club. There's still a Belgian club on the west side called the Harry Gary Club, which is still in operation. Because, as I said, you tended to gather in ethnic enclaves. You tended to stay with the people with whom you had common interests, and oftentimes that was working in the mill. So know that. As we move into the future, though, Manchester's picture started to change. Amoskeag ran into financial difficulties. It survived for almost a century, but in 1922, they had a large general strike in Amoskeag. It was the first big strike that ever had in the company. 17,000 people worked there, and 17,000 people walked out in 1922. They were on strike for 9 months. Why? Because Amoskeag was facing competition from textile mills in the south. So they told the workers on one day, your 48-hour work week is now 54 hours, and we're cutting your pay 20% at the same time. How'd you like that? Didn't fly. This vote to go on strike was 15,000 something to about 1,000, so they walked out. And for 9 months, these people had to live on what they called the dole. There were relief agencies were coming to help the workers, and it was universal. Regardless of what language you spoke, you were hungry. You were going without. And so Manchester's immigrant communities tended to bond together. They forged a real relationship that crossed ethnic lines. How does assimilation take place? It's when a French-Canadian girl marries an Irish boy. It's when a Greek boy marries a Belgian girl. And that's how eventually, we assimilate into a society. And that took place in Manchester. Now we're talking about another wave of immigration. Manchester is a designated refugee sanctuary city. So people from all over the world, nations in turmoil, Sudan, Bosnia, think about it, the Republic of Congo, Ivory Coast, are coming to Manchester and fighting the same battle that was fought by other immigrants who came before them. Generally, there's a process of thought by which close the door after I get here. Okay, so when those first Irish Canadians came here, the Scot-Irish weren't that happy about it. The Yankees didn't like the Irish that much. And then when the Irish finally get settled and the Greeks came, they didn't like the Greeks that much. So they would have turf battles. And this is something that happens today. In fact, Calivas Park, which is right behind the Southern New Hampshire University Arena, and that's the first time I didn't say Verizon Wireless Arena, by the way. That park became a battleground for different ethnic groups because tenements surrounded it, and they were the least expensive housing in the city, so the newest immigrants tended to gravitate there. For the Irish, it was called the Carrot Field. And then when the Greeks came, they wanted that to become their village square. The word is Messachorty. And so there was a battle between the Irish and the Greeks over who would reign over that park. So it wasn't always peaceful, it wasn't always easy to come to this country, but we've demonstrated in Manchester that we are a welcoming city, and I hope that continues to this day. You all know that we have the first presidential primary in the nation, right? Well, last year, when that was taking place, we had an exhibit about Manchester's role in the history of the primary. And it was fascinating because we had pictures of John F. Kennedy in Victory Park and Dwight Eisenhower in a limousine on Elm Street celebrating all these people who came here. But if you remember that primary debate, there was a lot of hurtful talk about refugees and immigrants. Some of the candidates had some really ridiculous proposals to deal with refugees and immigrants. And personally, that ticked me off, because I know that Manchester's always been a city of immigrants, a welcoming city. So we decided to do an exhibit utilizing photographs from this book of the new Americans. These are brilliant color photographs. My friend Becky Field did the book, and she had unbelievable access to the new refugees and immigrants coming to Manchester. They welcome her to their family ceremonies, births and christenings, funerals, baptisms. And by chronicling their life in the city with brilliant color, we said, let's take those pictures, blow them up big, and juxtapose them with our historic photos of the different immigrant groups as they arrived in Manchester. So we put out a plea in the paper. If you have photographs of your family when they first arrived in Manchester from another country, let us borrow them, we'll scan them, we'll blow them up, and we'll include them in the exhibit. So the end result was a remarkable documentation of Manchester's history as an immigrant city right to the very day. We knew it was important for new Americans to see that exhibit, especially kids, school kids, to understand that they may feel out of place as they arrive in Manchester, but know that you're not alone. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of others have gone through the same thing, coming to this community and eventually are welcomed into it. So it was important. We reached out to school groups, Beach Street School. My good friend Christine Brennan is the principal. We said, we would love your kids to come to the museum, no charge, my treat, just so they can see this exhibit and come to understand what this is all about. So they had a walking field trip, which I thought was remarkable. Would you teachers ever walk about 1.5 miles with your group and then walk 1.5 miles back with lunch in the middle? If you do, then you're welcome to come to the Millyard Museum. I'd love to see that. And without cattle prods, I don't know how you could do it. But it was important. We reached out to the Holy Cross Family Learning Center on the west side, where they have adult English language learners to come to the museum and see this and recognize it. Among the more telling things, all the photographs on the wall, we put up a map of the world, and we got some blue pins, and we put a pin in every country that was represented by the photos on the wall. And then I bought a box of red pins. And as visitors came, we asked them to go to the map at the end of the exhibit and put the pin in the country that your family left to come to Manchester, whether it was your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents. And that was remarkably moving. We had no idea when we did that it would touch people. We had a group of men from Bhutan, which is in Asia, and they were about 30 of them. And Bhutan is a really small country. On the map, it's about that big. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh no, how are we going to get 30 pins into Bhutan? Without even asking us, they got together and they agreed that they would put one pin in that would represent all of them, which I thought was remarkably moving. We had a group from West High School. They have a STEAM program and they also have some ESL classes over there. And we had them at the museum one evening, and a young boy went through the exhibit and he was looking at the map of Africa. He was from the Ivory Coast. And he looked at the Ivory Coast and there were no pins in the map. So he was able to be the first one to put a pin in Ivory Coast. And when he walked away, I saw the tear coming down his cheek. This is about being a welcoming community. There's a group called Welcoming America, also called Welcoming Manchester. And my mission is to go to these different groups, talk about our history as an immigrant city, then and now, and make people aware that we are made better when we welcome new people into the fabric. We need new ideas, we need new energy, we need people to work. We don't have enough smart, intelligent, talented workers in this community, so we need more. And the way we get more is by being welcoming and embracing these people who come to welcome in Manchester. So I'm enlisting all of you now, as a community in this school, to do the same thing. Ask people where they're from. They love to talk about their homeland, and they're proud of it, and they should be. And we should be made richer by their experience, and we celebrate that at the Manchester Historic Association, where I'm the executive director, and also at the Millyard Museum, where we did that exhibit on Manchester's immigrants then and now. Any questions? I covered it all. Look at that.
I'll make an observation.
An observation from Mr. Barrett.
When I came to Manchester, I came from Connecticut. When I came to Manchester, this was a very ethnic community. You could almost tell by what streets would bound each area.
Mm-hmm.
There was the north end of Manchester, north of Webster Street, where all the mill yard superintendents and their descendants lived. There was a, you know, in between for the people that were the NCO type middle management in the mills. There was then, you know, down around around the Verizon, there was another group that were basically at that time Greeks. Okay, the west side was almost entirely French, except for the Belgians, the Germans, and the Irish, but they all had specific areas. You know, things have changed so much since 1965 that you wouldn't recognize Manchester today, where so much of that has been integrated. So anyone who is new, you know, has just got to experience that same thing. So 50 years from now, they can look back on it and see their descendants integrated into the area.
Another way this shows up, I'm sorry.
Just real quick, guys. How many people here, when you go home, a different language is spoken? There you go. That's me.
Yeah. As a seasoned observer of immigrants and their assimilation into Manchester, there are signs to look for. As your question indicates, language is a key thing. Because young people are much more adept at picking up languages than our older people. So the kids tend to pick up English much faster than their parents, but as you indicated, when they go home, they speak in whatever their native language is. You will find that there will be resistance to that among the younger generation. After a while, if they go out with their parents, they're embarrassed because they're speaking their native language. This happened here in Manchester with the French Canadians. My friends who grew up in French-speaking households rebelled against that, and they were embarrassed when their parents spoke French in public, and they would only speak in English. That's happening today. When you go to Beach Street School, and it's parents' night, the parents come in and the kids have to speak to them in their native language. They translate for them. So you get resistance to that. And in fact, in the Franco-American world now, there's a movement called La Survivance. They want to preserve the culture that they denied when they were teenagers because they now embrace their family's French-Canadian heritage. That will happen with other ethnic groups as well. Another thing you may have noticed is clothing. When newcomers first come to the country, they tend to wear their native dress. And as this book celebrates, it's brilliant and colorful, but over time, the kids become aware that they're looking different. And what's the one thing you don't want to be when you're a teenager? You don't want to stand out. You don't want to be different from the rest. Not everybody, but in most cases. So you will see their dress start to change as they try to assimilate. They want to blend in. And it's a shame because ultimately, you know, when they get older, they'll come to cherish their culture and celebrate it. But there is that hard transition time for kids. And that's something we need to be aware of as well. This book does celebrate them in their native costume, but I would wager that 5 years from now, the kids in this book who are dressed in, you know, Polish costumes or Bosnian costumes won't want to dress that way because they'll want to fit in. And that's something that, you know, there's a little good and bad with assimilation. You know, we lose some of that richness, but they feel that they're part of the fabric of the community. And, you know, that's an apt metaphor, fabric of the community, because we are a textile city. And it's all about the weave of the different ethnic groups that come together that makes this such a rich place to live and work, stay and play. Questions? Okay, we nailed it. Michelle.
Judd, I remember hearing a story you told about the Merrimack River and the color of the river that was dependent. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, in the beginning, when Amoskeag Manufacturing first started operating, I mentioned that they dug 2 canals. If you go to the mill yard today, you will never realize that Commercial Street was actually a canal. It was not a paved road. And Bedford Street, which runs parallel to Canal Street, that was the upper canal. And the way it worked, they built a dam to direct the water into the canals, and the mill yard's built on a gentle slope down to the river. So the water from the upper canal, which was Bedford Street, would flow into my mill building, mill number 3, and turn a turbine that would power the looms, all interconnected, and then it would empty out down into Commercial Street, which was then a canal. Then it would go into the mill buildings facing the river and power those looms, and then simply discharge back into the Merrimack. Now, when you drive on the Everett Turnpike on the west side of the city, if you look back at the mill yard, you'll see the discharge vessels that actually carried the water back into the river. So ecologically, it was minimal damage. It was incredibly ingenious to be able to do that. But as I mentioned, when the product line changed, they started doing different things in the mills, and that eventually had a major impact on the Merrimack River. For instance, if they were dyeing red, I mentioned the Scottish dyers would come to make gingham dresses. If red was the color of the day, you would look down at the river and the river would be red. A day later, it might be green. A day later, it could be blue, depending on what they were doing. So as the company grew, it started to have more of a negligent effect on the Merrimack River. Ultimately, where the Elliott at River's Edge is today, over by the Queen City Bridge, there was a slaughterhouse there. It was called Jack Pack. And there would be days when you would be playing baseball at Bakersville School, and the stench from the slaughterhouse was so bad, I played the entire game with my glove over my face. Smelling leather was probably the same as smelling what they were doing. And you would see entire cowhides floating down the river if they were accidentally discharged into the water. So that was one of the I guess the worst effects of the Emskeg was ultimately polluting the Merrimack River. But fortunately, in 1967, they passed what they called the Clean Water Act. And in the 50 years since then, we'll be celebrating that anniversary this summer. The Merrimack River has come back to almost pristine condition because it's not used for industry anymore. It's primarily used for recreation. So it was an interesting time to know. So, yes?
So what I'm getting from this presentation, because I love your stories and I love everything that you're talking about Manchester because represent Manchester. And so I guess what I'm getting is that you're trying to say it's okay to be diverse. And then I guess my question is like, what are you saying is diverse? Because the word diversity and it's okay to be different is so clouded now. Like there is no, we're being told to be different in so many different ways. And also, I know that MST has experienced a lot, but you say that it's great to be diverse and we should be proud of Manchester. But so many people have moved out of Manchester because of the immigration and of the welcomingness. And so you were talking about earlier that they don't like representatives from us because we represent ethnicity versus race. So I guess I'm asking like, what is your definition of diverse and how do you expect us or want us to make this difference? Because I believe diversity is good, but I don't know how to make an impact if I don't even know the definition of diverse anymore.
That's welcoming. Being welcoming is a way to encourage diversity. I can't imagine growing up in Manchester without my Greek friends, without my Irish friends, without my French Canadian friends, because their experiences colored my existence. I came to know more about their world and their cultures simply by embracing them. If I only stuck to the French English-speaking kids, my life would have been a lot less fascinating than it has been because of those friendships. So now I'm part of the group called Welcoming Manchester. I speak every time they have a new group come into town and talk about the history of ethnic diversity in Manchester, make people recognize that we have been a melting pot throughout our existence and continue to do so. And how do you do that? By being welcoming, by being curious, knowing that these people bring experiences that you don't have that will enrich your life as well if you embrace them as friends. So by diversity, it means being different, recognizing that we come from different cultures with different languages and different traditions, and when you learn about them, your experience is broadened as well. So that's when I say diversity, it's recognizing that we're different, and that doesn't mean we have to be apart. So we can be together in that. That help? Probably not. It's a hard question.
Yeah, it really is. It's hard to sit here too, though, and know that so many people have left Manchester for something that you're preaching about. And like, I agree completely. I think that your exhibit must be amazing. And now I want to go see it. But
we are going to bring it back. It's not there. It's actually traveling. It was in Concord at the Capitol Center for the Arts because they have a great program up there as well. And people are so moved by it that it's hard for me to get it back. I keep saying, it's like, people want us to put that exhibit back up again, and we want to do so, but I'm also pleased that other people want to see it, and they recognize the power of it. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that we came up with. I will tell you that I was driving my car on Pine Street in the downtown area of Manchester, and my car broke down near Pine and Orange Street. So I got out of my car, and I thought, well, I have to wait for AAA. So I went and I sat on the steps of what used to be St. George's Greek French-Canadian Church. And it was July, it was like 90 degrees, and I thought, I'm gonna die here. I have to go get something to drink. So I walked up to a little superette on Orange Street, and I went into the store and I was looking for a Diet Coke. And I finally found one, so I grabbed it and I put it on the counter, and the gentleman behind the counter, clearly new to Manchester, he was from Sudan as it turned out, and I put down the Diet Coke. And he looked at me and said, no need diet. I said, oh yeah, I do, I need Diet Coke. No, no need diet. So we started talking over that simple thing of putting a can of soda there. And so we talked about how he came here, and I was waiting for AAA. I was happy in the air-conditioned store. And so we struck a bond. And so I went back and I sat on the steps of the church with my bottle of Diet Coke, and I remembered my friend Becky Field. And I said, you know what, I bet if I call her, she'll let me use her photos, and I can do an exhibit that will show Manchester's ethnic history. That's how it came to me. It was that accidental a circumstance that my car broke down. And I went and I met a man from Sudan, and all of a sudden, I have this idea for this great exhibit. I don't get great ideas very often, and I don't like it when my car breaks down, but if my car breaks down and I come away with something like this, that's a good day. So that's how it came, completely by accident, by being aware, and I hope you're all aware now, of Manchester's history as a melting pot, that you'll be aware when you meet somebody from a new country, from a new nation, someone who's recently arrived here in Manchester, and probably desperately looking for a friend. So that's part of the welcoming thing too. Anything else? I know it's getting warm in here. We good? Okay, with that, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Tom, for asking me to come. I hope this has been beneficial for you.